Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times bestselling author. Each week, Dr. Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest on a range of compelling topics, from literature to psychology to financial wellness. To learn more about Dr. Crosby's behavioral finance work at Orion, visit www.orion.com.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby, and I am joined today by Dr. Brian Portnoy, author of an incredible book, The Geometry of Wealth, among other incredible books, and the founder of Shaping Wealth. Brian, welcome to the show.
Good to see you, Daniel.
Good to see you, bud. You have done something incredibly improbable, which you have created a viral tweet about behavioral finance. I didn't know it could be done, and yet here you sit. So congratulations.
Thank you. And as we've joked about recently, I also wrote a viral thread about why I have too many coffee mugs, which seemed to touch a nerve worldwide. And so I will take the fork in the road toward BFI, but anytime you want to break into the coffee mug thing, I'm here for it.
Meb Faber does this thing when you're on his podcast. He looks up, there's some system where you can look up someone's most popular tweet, and then he asks them about their most popular tweet. And when I was on his show, my most popular tweets of all time are all inane. Like all the stuff that I put my heart and soul into falls flat. And then you tweet about coffee mugs and you're an overnight sensation. But you actually tweeted about something substantive and had success. That most rare combination. And that Twitter thread is going to serve largely as the basis for our conversation today. So you say in the first tweet, I love this. You say that airport bookstores have heralded the arrival of BFI and that Nobel Prizes have been awarded, but that in spite of all this, we have created what you called, and this is brilliant, a behavioral finance entertainment complex that does very little to help real people make real decisions. Talk to me about this.
First thing, as a always recovering academic, shout out to Evan Burr. He used that phrase, behavioral finance entertainment complex, and I don't like to quote others without giving them due credit. So thank you, Evan. Hope you're listening, my friend.
Evan Burr, it must be said, friend of the show, previous guest, and accomplished heavy metal guitarist, Evan Burr.
He's a cool dude. But
he's a cool guy.
Maybe we'll do an Evan Burr podcast someday, but not today. So look, you and I have been swimming in the same waters for many, many years now. And there is something so illuminating and motivational and exciting about the behavioral sciences and what we can learn about ourselves and each other and how we get along or don't. And then specifically, what we'll call behavioral finance is sort of taking that and applying it to money, sort of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to make good versus bad decisions? And then somewhere along the way, a few thousand years ago, this thing called money was invented, and now it intermediates relationships and our sense of self in a way that we're coming to terms with still and haven't, come close to fully figuring out. Great, period, end of paragraph. And you and I built, careers of sorts on those insights, which we love. The observation that I started out with in this tweet was that it's actually somehow over the last couple or 5 years gotten kind of boring and stale and repetitive. And, I will get into it, but I launched this company, Shaping Wealth, that focuses on applied behavioral science for the wealth management industry. And so in working with lots of financial advice firms and many advisors inside those firms, it's very clear that what you and I have been so excited about for many years now is boring to them. And I think they're not wrong in the sense that, and I'll ask you a question after, but like I have given probably not as many speeches as you, but lots and lots of speeches on this sort of stuff. And I walk off the stage and I get the exact same question every time, or comment/question, which is, that was really interesting. How do I use that in my practice?
Mm.
So for as much as we know about type 1 versus type 2 thinking fast and slow, rationally or rational, whatever that book is called, Nudge and Thaler, you've got serious professionals who are on the front lines of helping people make good financial decisions, who are more than smart enough to understand these topics, but have never really heard anything particularly practical about how to apply them. And so I think I might have just opened like 4 or 5 different doors to go through, but one I'll just mention now is that there's been this huge focus on biases and the way in which humans are biased and how that leads to bad and, dare I say, quote unquote, irrational decisions. And I think, I don't want to call it a mistake, but I think that we've overstayed our welcome on just one element of a much more important story to tell.
Yeah, we're in absolute agreement there. Do you think that we overlook the good that behavioral finance has done because the good that it's done is subtle and simple? Like if you look at something like Save More Tomorrow, it's this simple idea that sort of the automation of the escalation of savings over time into a 401k should occur for the variety of behavioral reasons, right? And by all accounts, it's benefited the American investor to the tunes of tens to hundreds of billions. Like that's a big deal, but we don't, it's so simple almost with 2020 hindsight that we don't give it credit. Like, have we done more than we think and we're overlooking it, or do you really think we haven't done much good?
Well, I strongly believe we haven't done as much good as we could. I don't believe that no good has been done. So there are some landmark achievements in the field of nudges and default settings where, organizations have been able to incentivize or structure a decision-making process whereby, somebody saves more for retirement. And, so the program that you talked about, that you mentioned, Save More Tomorrow, that's sort of the one really big example. And so in the incredibly narrow, not from a relevant dollars point of view, but in terms of all the money decisions we make, in this one very narrow sleeve of how we conduct ourselves in the context of a corporate retirement program, there was a huge victory, like a massive landmark victory in terms of the way that this has been rolled out by changing the default from I want to invest versus what it had been, which is I don't want to invest unless I flip the switch. There's another victory afoot that, frankly, I think that you and me are maybe part of the tailwind in these wind in these sails through our writing and the different jobs we've had over the years in terms of sensitizing what was once truly a hard-nosed brokerage business into taking humans seriously, which maybe we can get into that. But, specifically thinking about the goals that we set for ourselves and our loved ones, and maybe not being averse to the psychology that goes into that. I mean, we've got tons of throwaway lines that are great that we've all cited. Ben Graham wrote about, the investor being his own worst enemy. We've got Howard Marks saying, if you should get one degree in this field, it should be in psychology, not in finance. And those are kind of nice little dopamine hits. But short of laminating a note card with those quotes on them, we're still left with a massive gap. And I'll come back to the experience of having given hundreds of speeches and getting the same comment over and over again, which is, cool, what do I do now? And the answer, not leaving aside, but including things like Save More Tomorrow, we're on our way, but it hasn't been, I haven't seen a lot of positive momentum out there.
So I've given the same speeches and agree that that's the number one question time after time after time. And I think and now that I consider it in conversation with you, I think there's really two things at play. One is people like you and I need to do more to embed behavioral finance in practical ways in the everyday lives of financial advisors. Like I'm not trying to duck that responsibility. And I think there's a ton of great work to be done. And I think that, you and I are trying to do it, and other smart folks. But I do think that part of it is that the answers are sort of inherently unsatisfactory in some ways. I mean, I go back to being a therapist, and it was like, you would have people come into your office, and they're sort of looking for a grand slam. They're looking for a magic pill or a potion. And the answers to shifting perception and to subtle changes in human behavior are almost universally unsexy. And so I think some of the times the prescription is just kind of falls flat because it's not seen as sort of world beating enough. Do you see that at all? Do you think that there's good that we can be doing that doesn't get picked up because it doesn't seem enough like a magic wand?
So, like most points in my career, my aspirations start with self-criticism. That was my transition from academia to finance, and that was my, transition from being an investor to, focusing more on all of this behavioral stuff. And, my first book, The Investor's Paradox, was largely a tale of how was at, picking good mutual fund and hedge fund managers and spending a fair amount of time in my own head and also in the library figuring out, well, why was that? And is anybody really good at it? And maybe we can move the ball forward. So, I'd want to get, the idea that this is somebody else's problem is the opposite impression I want to give. The problem is I haven't made as much of a difference. So the question is, how can I make a difference? What you're pointing to in terms of the subtlety and the diffusiveness of this is, I think, precisely why we haven't gotten very far, because we work in a very quote unquote practical industry. And so, a financial advisor, she wants a good and then a better portfolio planning system, and a good and then a better CRM, and all of these pieces of kit that make, you go, faster in the right direction in serving a lot of clients. The whole premise of human first financial advice is that the first thing you need to do in your job, and I use the word need is sometimes an offensive verb, but like you need to understand who is sitting across the table from you, whether it's an individual or couple or a multi-generational family. And it's very hard, if not, and I would say impossible, to strap an ROI to that exercise. But, and very, very well, my dear friend and partner in building Shaping Wealth, Dr. Joy Leary, she's very strident in saying that the soft skills are the hard skills, and that, the woo-woo stuff on really understanding what makes humans tick, that doesn't necessarily lead to a trade or a tweak to a portfolio or something like that. Well, the fact that it doesn't lead to a number not only makes it hard, it signals that it might be more important than the numbers themselves. And so, like, one thing that we're focusing on and writing about and working with teams from all over is, and it's maybe the core idea that we're working with advisors now, is empathy. And there's no algorithmic expression of empathy. It's how do you, from your own authentic lens, meaning, you are who you are, so you have to have some level of self-awareness. How do you become more empathetic? Which very much involves being a better active listener, but there's a lot of other, skills. Empathy is a skill, but it's not measurable. At the same time, you sort of know when you're doing it better or worse. And when you think about the direction of the wealth management business, there is a major movement, a push toward a focus on broader financial well-being as distinct from portfolio results, that absent better empathy skills, people are going to underperform what they could do for the clients sitting across from them.
So I was putting together a deck that I'll be giving soon. And I ran across an Accenture study on what clients want from advisors. And the number one result, 91%, was someone who gets me, which is empathy, right? Which is empathy. And then you think about how little, I think, time, effort, structure we have provided to the process of getting the people who sit across the table from us in at least, in a scientific, systematic way. I think we got some big work to do to live up to our client expectations. So, Brian, I want to pivot to the second question. As part of this tweet storm, as part of this critique, you say that you have mixed feelings about nudges and nudge units, right? So Nudge, of course, is based on Richard Thaler's book that was sort of this seminal path-breaking book. Nudge units are sort of the employment outcropping of his ideas, and they've become big. The British nudge unit made big waves, I think, and you've seen others spring up. So I feel like we're not constrained by 280 characters now, so we can have a better discussion about this. What do you see as sort of the good, bad, and ugly of nudging, and how can or can't it be applied to our field of wealth management?
Yeah. Okay. Here we go. Yeah, I totally. You know me well enough to know that I totally punted on that issue. Like you can't do side tweets in a tweet thread, but yeah, I wanted to go there, but couldn't. So we can go there a little bit. So, let's go back to Thaler and Nudge and that book and that research and everything that it spawned. And let's revisit the polysyllabic phrase that he used to define it, which is libertarian paternalism. Okay, which I love because it's such a jumble of stuff that takes a while to unpack. We won't unpack it too much, but it basically means let people do what they want and don't let them know that you're their daddy. It's an interesting concept, and in some ways there's nothing new about it. Channeling Cialdini, who we both love. Like all we've done since the beginning of time is influence each other. And there's different ways to do it. There's better and worse ways to do it. There's subtle ways. There's heavy-handed ways. And so this idea of nudge, in some ways, it's just a great word. And sometimes it's just a word captures something. So how do you nudge people to do something in the empirical sense, and from the normative sense, something that you would consider that produced a better outcome, either at the individual level or when you aggregate all those decisions at the societal level. The mixed feelings, and the chance that Ben Hunt listens to this podcast is slim, but I am going to send it to him because he writes so brilliantly and so sharply about the nudging state and the nudging oligarchy and nudges everywhere. I think it is okay, and here I might disagree with Ben a little bit, to encourage people to do things that I or we might judge to be good outcomes. So, let's just take the total, save more tomorrow. Let's nudge, many people for a few different reasons don't save much of anything for their retirement. And decades down the road, if they were given the choice, they're like, geez, I wish I put a few bucks away every paycheck. So how can we nudge people to save a little bit more? And in that case, the nudge technology is the default setting in the 401k or 403b plan. And I think that's sort of a very narrowly bounded situation that doesn't present much, if any, ethical challenges. Because I think one of the comebacks I would have against nudge dissenters is that in many cases, there's no non-default situation.
Sure.
It is what it is. So there are simple coordination problems like, hey, we drive on the right side of the road. Doesn't matter if we drive on the left. We just have to all be in agreement. So, that's even simpler at the organ donation level, at the retirement savings level. I don't think it's unreasonable to say, hey, saving more or leaving aside religious prescriptions, organ donation. I don't think it's controversial to say, oh, that's probably a better outcome. And no matter what, there is a default. So the default is you're not going to save. If you change the default to you are going to save, but it takes the same 2 seconds to change what the toggle is, I don't find that overly oppressive. Where the spectrum comes in and the dial comes in is when nudging becomes manipulation, and when the objectives of the nudger are at minimum opaque and worse, reflect a nefarious agenda. And so, say what you will about the uselessness of what you and I do every day, Daniel, there are thousands of people who make Tostitos crunchier. And they are creating a crunch in our mouth that is addictive. That is a nudge. Mm-hmm. I happen to think that's not a good use of time or societal resources, but lots of people make lots of money making chips crunchier, or crunchy in a way, have optimal crunchiness. There is such a thing as too much crunch. Okay, so somewhere along this path, we can move from ethical encouragement to outright manipulation. I don't think there's kind of a calculus to where that line is. I just think there's a spectrum of things with the, sort of the understanding that there's no situation that we'll ever encounter where there isn't a default. There's no totally clean situation. There always has to be a default. It's either on or off. And we just have to take the time as individuals, as communities, as larger societies to understand what choices are being put in front of us. And just to wrap up, what makes Ben Hunt's stuff so brilliant is that he so fantastically kind of digs into narratives that get created wittingly or unwittingly by powerful entities that shape the way that we see the world. So at the basis level of what we even want from our lives are being nudged in ways that we're not even aware of. And so at that extreme, that's uncool. But at the level of saving for your retirement and, hey, maybe you should do it this way instead of the other way, what's wrong with that?
Yeah, we're in total agreement on a couple of things. First of all, Ben Hunt is a great thinker and a great Alabaman, I might add.
He is.
The other thing that I love about your conversation here is there's no such thing as no default. I think we'd be wise to recognize that. Some of these nudges that we talk about, it's sort of just being more thoughtful about defaults. You think about some of the things in the book, reordering the presentation of children's lunches, right? So you put the vegetables first instead of the dessert. The kids eat more vegetables because the tray is full and they don't have room for the dessert. Good, everybody wins, right? Healthier kids, better diet. That's pretty uncontroversial. But if you look at some of the ways, and I'm going to try not to get political here, but if you look at some of the ways that things like psychographic targeting and some of those nudges around Cambridge Analytica scandal and, deep understanding of people's psychographics and their behaviors to kind of scare them into voting, one way or another, that's a little bit more controversial. And I think we need to be thoughtful and ethically minded to make sure that our libertarian paternalism is more libertarian than it is paternalistic. So all of that is all those points are, I think, well taken.
Thanks.
Yeah. So, when I think about the history of psychology, right? So when you think about the early days of psychology, we first studied brokenness, right? Before we moved on in fairly recent times to positive psychology. And I see a similar move afoot in behavioral finance, right? When you think about the early behavioral economists, they almost necessarily had to start with biases. They had to start with deviations from normalcy because it was this groundbreaking sort of fissure with the existing way of doing things. But we've been sort of mired in this obsession with biases and quirks and anomalies for a long time. And I think an outcropping of this is this idea that it's an advisor's sort of highest and best use to diagnose sort of what's wrong with someone from a bias perspective, and then quote unquote fix those biases. You take that on in your tweet thread. How do you envision, as we move towards this more, we'll call it positive behavioral finance world, how do you envision an advisor working in a highest and best way with a client with respect to their behavior?
So I love the way that you teed this up. And one nice thing is that I know just from our own friendship and conversations, we've both been grappling with this for many, many years. I personally feel like we're getting to some more clarity at the kind of industry level on this. And it does start, as you suggest, recognizing that even the practice of psychology has evolved significantly over the last century, that so much of, you could talk about, late 19th century and the invention of modern psychology, but really the acceleration of the field after World War II in response to absolutely horrible things happening and broken people needing to repair themselves. That's been played out in the biases literature in behavioral finance for 40 years now. And, going back and rereading the early Kahneman and Tversky, rereading Thinking Fast and Slow, it's not entirely their fault. There's a lot of nuance there. And you can go back 30 years in Kahneman's research and see straight up positive psychology. Mm-hmm. So Marty Seligman's, big keynote speech to the APA was 89 or 90, something like that, where he's like, hey, we need to move on. We need to elevate people who are in okay shape in addition to fixing broken people. And Danny and all of those, brilliant folks, they were sort of on top of it. But for whatever reason, and we're not anthropologists, in our industry, it has landed that people are biased, biases are bad, and we need to, at minimum, understand them and at best fix them. There is something supremely arrogant about anyone, including, and maybe especially a financial advisor with no psychology training. And I work with, I'm not you, I'm not Joy. I'm not a PhD in psychology. I'm not licensed. There are some bright lines that you can't and shouldn't cross in terms of what you talk to people about. But here we are as money professionals, self-proclaimed investment and market experts, trying to say, oh, you're overconfident, or you're anchoring, or, oh, this is Monday morning quarterbacking. And, there's something commonsensical about some of those observations with our clients. But I also know firsthand, in looking at the programs and curricula that have been designed for financial planners to learn and apply, that, I'm not going to name names, but I could name 3 large organizations that teach their clientele in certificate granting programs, certification granting programs, that it is their job to identify the following 27 biases. And depending on how rich or poor you are and what age you are, put you in some quadrant and treat you specifically to what your condition has been assessed. And it's BS. It's not the way psychology goes. It's not the way our brains are wired, and it's not the way good advice should go. So, it's just truly arrogant to think that you're going to, a client's going to come to your office and you're going to diagnose them and tell them what's wrong with them, let alone, say that you can fix it. So what's the highest and best use? We could talk about that. And, this is where we get into, positive psychology, taking people who are in okay shape, you have good days or bad days, but still, like, people are in okay shape, and figure out how to elevate them. I think the really good modern advisor combines the practical and the profound. The practical is just getting your stuff organized, getting everything in one place, anticipating the decisions that you need to make, holding you to deadlines, to make those decisions, and kind of keeping your fingers crossed that it works out, that you've played the probabilities right. And then the profound, which is a deeper, longer conversation, is really helping people understand where financial well-being fits into a meaningful life, geometry of wealth, funded contentment, the things you and I have talked about for years. And you've been more than generous in promoting, some of the stuff that I've been working on all this time. There's a whole mess of things that financial planners and advisors and financial coaches can do to help people understand their money stories better, and within that context, make better decisions. But absent that more narrative understanding of what makes somebody tick, it's hard to get there. But it's hard to get there for the advisor herself because she hasn't been trained in this stuff. Part of what we're doing at Shaping Wealth is offering that training.
Sort of pulling on this thread a little bit more, I do think you're starting to see a current of moving from labeling behavior as irrational to sort of normalizing it. Meyer Statman's book was called Finance for Normal People, right?
Yeah.
You've heard you and me and Carl Richards and other folks in the industry talking about like this is sort of normal stuff. And indeed, when I was training to be a clinical psychologist, the first thing we would do with our clients, I mean, this was directive number one, was to normalize their behavior, which is to say, look, you're not alone. Other people experience this. This is like, there's a reason, you're feeling the things you're feeling, and sort of normalize that behavior. I don't see that happening in our industry as much. And the reason I think it doesn't happen is because people confuse normalization with permission, right? Mm. Just because you normalize a behavior doesn't mean it's a good behavior or an adaptive behavior. But I am a believer that if you know someone's entire financial story, that all behavior makes sense, even if it all doesn't serve their goals and their drives and their purposes. So how do we make that distinction? We don't want to pathologize people who are, acting a certain way. We don't want to pathologize this or make everything irrational. But I think some people are fearful of going too far in that direction and giving permission to things that aren't serving folks well.
God. I mean, this is what Joy and I talk about every day. And Neil, I mean, I wish I had a crisp answer to the question. I think what you're asking is maybe the most important and difficult question in applied behavioral science in money world. Yeah, I guess the two-step is that step one is sort of sweeping up the mess that's been made a little bit. It's not a cataclysm, but sort of spill on aisle 9, let's go clean it up. Getting away from pathologizing normal behavior. And maybe we could talk about this through two, I think, pretty normal, but normal situations, but quite different from each other. The one is paying off your mortgage early. Mm-hmm. And the second is every 2 weeks, taking your entire paycheck and going to the casino and gambling it all. Right. So in the first case, there is a supposedly rational solution to whether or not you should pay off your mortgage early. And it has something to do with the cost of your debt and the expected rate of return on your assets. And let's just bracket that because I think a lot of your listeners will know the math. But there's supposedly a right answer. And, a couple of years ago, Josh Brown and I published this book called How I Invest My Money, and 25 different financial advisors telling their money story. And I'd say half the chapters, people discuss paying off their mortgage early. There wasn't a single person in the book who's confused about the math of retiring your mortgage before it's fully due. And I've done it. Morgan's done it. Josh hasn't. I mean, there's a host of issues. There's a mosaic of emotional relevancies to that debt and what your home means to you, in which you could have, I think, a broad conversation in which there might be disagreement between people as to the right thing to do. And so when we talk about, pathologizing, when we talk about quote unquote rational behavior and Shaping Wealth, like there, in our virtual office, which sort of doesn't exist, but it does, like rational is on the wall with a big, X through it. Like, it's just, we're not going there. We don't talk about rational versus irrational. It's too loaded. So is it irrational to pay off your mortgage early? In many, many cases, the answer is either no, or it depends. I guess it just depends. The other situation, where you're gambling your entire paycheck away every 2 weeks, and we sit with somebody and say, okay, let me understand, your money story and where you're coming from and why you're doing this. And this is clearly across the bright line that I couldn't go, that, it's a place that you enjoy could, because you're licensed and qualified. That's very, very dangerous behavior. It creates serious amounts of jeopardy in terms of that person's life and their family's life and other things. And so in your jargon, it would be maladaptive behavior, and we wouldn't want to normalize it in the sense that say this is a good thing to do, but and we might want to steer them differently. But I guess what I'm saying is that this word rational or irrational, I think it confuses more than it clarifies. And that normalizing human behavior in the sense of, well, where is this coming from? And how can we get to a better place if we want to get to a better place, is a door that's just now opening in different parts of the industry.
Yeah. I think it all comes down to goals, right? Because so much of the conversation around rational versus irrational has been framed against the yardstick of sort of economic, objective economic utility. So like if you've paid your house off at a time when the math says you would have made more money elsewhere, then you were quote unquote irrational. But what if your goal is to sleep well at night, or to have sort of a safety bucket in your head filled so that you can afford to take better risk with the rest of your assets, right? Yeah. I mean,
I might do a word swap. You said goals. I don't think that's wrong. I think a better word would either be preferences or values. Mm-hmm. Because, it's not a goal in the sense that, I want to save $1 million for retirement so I can have a certain cash flow in my, golden years. It's that, I value security, that sleep at night. Yeah. Who cares if I'm not top ticking, the return on my assets when I know that nobody can take my house from me. And, maybe there's good or bad reasons why you might have that fear, but, we could leave that to the side. So yeah, I'm not disagreeing. I would just throw the word values in there, and that we're kind of optimizing for certain values. One of the challenging things about economics over a very long period of time is that, and I appreciate that there's a lot of nuances, end of the day in economics and finance and in our world, more is better.
Mm-hmm, right.
And so I fight back pretty hard against that. We know on multiple levels, whether it be Barry Schwartz and choice architecture and the paradox of choice, that more isn't better, that there are tipping points where having more is actually very, very detrimental in specific ways, or just recognizing that many of the things that we're looking to maximize or optimize are non-quantifiable and have therefore not fallen into the purview of modern economics, especially as the mathematical revolution took over at my alma mater at Chicago, 40 or 60 years ago. So I'm sort of, fighting my own little campaign here against this notion that more is better, and that we need to just crack that open and realize that there's some digging to do.
Yeah, no, I love it. So your values drive your goals, which should drive your behaviors, but those behaviors need to be measured against the stated values and not against some sort of arbitrary external measure of more, right? I think that's right. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, let me just layer in something that I've been working on here. So we're talking about values. The specific phrase that I've been using is purpose-based planning, which sounds really like, I don't know, hallmarky or cheesy. It sounds like something a big organization would come up with in their marketing department. But I do believe that, this advent of goals-based wealth management, going back 15 years or so, was a marketing invention by the wirehouses just to relabel the same BS that they were selling. That said, there's a very, very good dimension to goals-based wealth management. It's better than just buying Anacott steel and hoping that, it goes up, which is what a lot of the wealth management industry was, i.e. brokerage for decades. That said, purpose and values precedes goals. And then from goals, you move on to priorities, and from priorities to behavior and decisions to outcomes. And then there's this feedback loop. It wasn't in the thread that got so much attention, but it was in the background in my mind, is that to this day, I had this conversation yesterday with a very large firm that might be a client, maybe not, who knows, someday, where behavioral finance, what people call behavioral finance, is a set of tools that kind of sit in a box on a shelf right alongside portfolio construction, risk management, and hey, we want to use behavioral finance in our practice. We're off the rails already when that sentence is spoken, because in my view, it's not a wrench that you use to tighten or loosen something. It's more akin to gravity, where it's just everywhere and it impacts things. And so when you think about figuring out who we are and what we want and the decisions to make in order to be who we want to be and achieve what we want to achieve, behavioral science, broad in the broadest definition, alongside philosophy and literature and theology and a bunch of things, it's in every step along the way. Like, it's just there like gravity. I know it's a big ask, and maybe it's too much. Maybe the bar is too high that I'm setting. But moving BFI 1.0's focus on understanding biases as a toolkit that you can use and / create, slick marketing materials, to BFI 2.0, where you just understand that it's behavior all the way down, and that as we help people, narrate their own lives, and we can be helpful or not, that understanding what makes them tick at the level of self-awareness, all the way to the level of, should I pick this or that mid-cap value fund, that there's something that behavioral scientists have to say at literally every step along the way, and there are dozens of steps.
Yeah, I think going back to our earlier conversation, I think that's why sometimes the question gets asked, like, how do I apply this? And it's hard to answer, because it's like, where do I begin? This should permeate, this should permeate every part of your practice. This should permeate your own sort of self-awareness and sort of self-development practice and how you arrive at the office. And so it's sort of everywhere and nowhere at once, if I could get a little cosmic with it.
Yeah. It's really hard. Like, I'm glad you said it, because that question we get when we walk off the stage, like, how do I use this? It feels like there should be an easy answer, but there's really not, because there's so much to it. And maybe there's so much to it and it's so complicated. Maybe it's, sometimes that tells you that the fight's not worth fighting. I actually think the fight is worth fighting, that there's so much along the way that we, as advisors or coaches, or advisors to advisors, can sort of introduce to their process. One thing I've done in a number of my talks over the last couple years is, and unfortunately mostly all of those are via Zoom, but I've done it live too, where you get to read body language more, is I start out, I have a stump speech that I keep evolving called Money, Happiness, and the Future of Advice. And my opening slide asks a question: are you responsible for your client's happiness? Now imagine asking that of Gordon Gekko and Bud Fox. Are you responsible for your client's happiness? They're selling, more Bud than Gordon in terms of, okay, I'm your broker, I'm going to sell you stuff. Blue Horseshoe loves Anacott Steel. He couldn't give two craps whether you're happy or not. He just wants the VIG. Mm. Fast forward, and so we're on this arc that I call From Gordon Gekko to Brene Brown, where, we do have much broader, deeper understanding of what it means to, sort of this more holistic sense of well-being, where financial well-being fits into it. And I think it's now 100% legitimate to ask, are you responsible for your client's happiness? Truth be told, it's a question that a lot of people find kind of uncomfortable. They're like, where are you coming from? Why would I be? But then, you take 10 minutes and you talk about the relationship between money and happiness, and whether it's better investment decisions or more disciplined saving and spending behavior. There's a pretty direct linkage between all of those decisions as an advisor you would 100% say you are involved with, and the well-being of your client. And as a side note, 99% of the thousands of advisors I've met over the years seem passionate about helping the families that have come to them. So Are you responsible for your client's happiness on a scale from 1 to 10? And the answers usually go from 4 to 9. That's where the range is. I think a lot of people answer 7 because it's not a dangerous place to be.
Right.
But that's a psychometric discussion, not a psychological one. And so when you ask, are you responsible for your client's happiness? I think we've begun to open a door in these talks, in these courses, in the technology, things that you write, technologies that you're building, things that we're building, where it's like, well, let's take this seriously, because it might be the case that somebody across the table from you needs your help and they're relying on you to make better decisions and lead a happier life. And there's like a really, really high chance that they are relying on you in part to lead a happier life, because if you screw up all of your money decisions, it's going to be hard to get there.
Mm. So you think about one of the things you talked about in the thread is moving from, you suggest a handful of directions in which we need to move. And one is a move from analysis to empathy. And I think empathy really embodies this whole conversation that we're talking about. So in some respects, empathy is sort of unsatisfactory as a tool to take, off the shelf and say, hey, how do I help my clients be more empathetic? But in fact, you're right when you suggested earlier that empathy is a skill, and there are practical things that we can teach advisors about empathy, and that it has a material impact on people's happiness and the way they make financial decisions. Can you say more about what we need to do to move towards empathy, and then any tips you have, either personally or from Dr. Leary, on what empathy looks like in the context of an advisor-client relationship?
Yeah. Boy, how do I give you a couple crisp bullets rather than blather on, which I tend to do on this topic. So, let's start first by saying that what empathy is not. Empathy is not sympathy. Sympathy is merely kind of feeling bad or good for someone in light of what you perceive to be a bad or a good thing. It's not bad to have sympathy, but it's not empathy. Empathy is a next level experience where you understand enough about that individual or that family, where you can understand at some emotional level what it is they're feeling, what it is they're not feeling, where they've come from, where they might want to go. The other end of the spectrum in terms of what empathy is not is drowning with somebody, meaning that, you are so in tune with them that there's what Dr. Leary calls emotional contagion. And it's just this devolved experience where everybody ended up in a worse spot. The therapist and the patient, the advisor and the client, they're just a wreck. But there's this really big middle zone where you can take practical steps to grow empathy from the perspective of who you are here and now. So I've got these two partners, Joy and Neil. We have different personalities, and the way in which we might be empathetic toward others is going to be different because we're different people. But there is a better version of us in that. The way that we talk about it, the way that we now run empathy seminars, some brief, some full day, with financial advisors and wealth management executives, is to appreciate that when you show up to a relationship, to a conversation that takes place over weeks and months and years, that there's a before and a during and an after in this sort of rhythm that you can be. And we have a recipe with 15 specific things of how you are empathetic before, during, and after your engagement. Because I want to go back to the fact that I feel so lucky, starting with Virtus, my gig at Virtus for almost 5 years, that I got a chance to meet so many financial advisors. I was more on the institutional hedge fund investing space, and so the world of financial advice was relatively new to me. And lo and behold, I got this deep end of the pool. Hey, travel with a bunch of wholesalers and meet financial advisors and talk to them about investor education and behavioral stuff. And then you end up realizing quite different than the institutional investment space, that these on-the-ground advisors care so deeply about the people that they're taking care of. They actually want to do better. Many of them are open to new and better, as long as you're not wasting their time and money. And so the empathy message seems to be going really well with a lot of people, because they know that listening, influencing, framing, leading, those are skills. Like, those are skills. And, those aren't things that you learn once, like the CFA exam, you bang it out and hopefully never think about it again. These are lifelong skills. So there's certainly people who think it's too woo-woo. That's fine. That's cool. It's not them. I mean, if your thing is, you're into the markets and the economy and you want to get it right and you try your best and you've got clients who rely on you to do that, that's great. We're not for you. We're not going to work with you. You're not going to be a client of ours, because, we're not converting. We're selling Bibles. We want to work with people who want to go from good to great on the EQ spectrum. We don't want to turn Gordon Gekko into Brene Brown. It would be a waste of everybody's time. So there's a lot going on with empathy. And I'll return to what Joy says, which is that, the soft skills are the hard skills. They sound woo-woo, they sound squish, but they're really not. There's and in fact, I think we have the intellectual I think we have the trademark for it now. It's what I've coined as rigorous empathy, that there is a process and a skill to employing empathy in a professional situation. And we, through this 15-step process, as well as some other stuff, we want to bring rigor to empathy.
Yeah, I think, rigorous empathy is maybe a good metaphor for behavioral finance 2.0, right? Like the concepts are all there. It's building frameworks and structures around these concepts. It's never going to be as magic pill or as magic wand as some people want it to be. It's never going to be the tool you can just take off the shelf, but it's not totally woo-woo either, right? I mean, there is some form, there is some structure to framing, empathy, all the things you've talked about. And I think that's where people like you and I need to take the profession, is helping advisors learn, systematically how to be Brene Brown and Gordon Gekko.
Yeah. Look, I'm on it. You're on it. You got to do it in a way that's impactful, that's efficient from a time point of view, that's not wasteful from a monetary point of view, but from where I've been sitting the last few months, as I finally, because we were heads down for a year and didn't tell anybody anything, but as I've kind of gone heads up a little bit, talking to a lot of people since around Thanksgiving, and we're sitting here in early February, this is not a hard conversation to have. It doesn't mean that everybody's buying everything and they're like, hey, whatever it costs, let's do it. And, no, but in terms of, okay, I'm glad you're going in this direction. It's good to see that you and others are increasingly thinking about this and that there are some resources out there.
Well, growing up the son of an advisor, I saw how concerned my dad was for his clients, how central he was to their lives, how serious he was about being good to them and doing right by them and their families. And then working in the business like you, that's not an isolated thing. That's not just like my dad's a good guy thing. That's how, 99.9% of advisors are. So I'm glad for people like you who are helping them do it better. So if people want to learn more about you, if they want to get your books, if they want to learn more about shaping wealth, how do we follow you?
Yeah, it's real simple. Our website is shapingwealth.com. It gives you a little bit of information about who we are and what we do. We are offering one flagship program now called Building the Behavioral Advisor. And it is, I gotta say, I think it's going to be pretty cool. It's our first cohort of 10 people launches in a few weeks. And we're going to do just a handful of cohorts each year for people who really want to dig in and have a little bit of fun. So you can learn a little bit about that on the website. If you want to learn more, you can, reach me or anybody on the team through the site. And then for better or for worse, I'm on Twitter too much. And I'm at Brian Portnoy. And I don't know if it'll be in the show notes, but this thread on behavioral finance 2.0, which got a ridiculous number of impressions. It was by far the biggest thing that's ever, landed on Twitter for me. As we joke about, Twitter is kind of ridiculous, but at the same time, how many great friends we've made and how many smart things we've learned from generous people. So it's sort of my office that's on in the background most of the time.
Sure.
And I'm at Brian Portnoy.
Sure. And if people are interested in what Brian and his team are up to, we've mentioned Neil Beige was a previous guest of the show. So go look up my previous interview with Neil Beige, and Dr. Joy Leary has actually been a guest of the show twice. So go look up Joy's previous interview with me, Neil's interview, and of course, Brian, thank you. Congrats on all the cool stuff you're doing, and let's keep building the future of behavioral finance.
I appreciate it, buddy. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.